The most effective way to prevent a crime has absolutely nothing to do with the threat of a prison cell or a heavy fine. In fact, for about 99% of human history, the very idea of a criminal justice system would have sounded like an elaborate, unnecessary joke. If you really want to understand how our ancestors kept the peace, you have to stop looking at law books and start looking at your office's communal refrigerator. You know the feeling, that low-simmering, righteous fury that bubbles up when you realize someone has borrowed your expensive Greek yogurt without asking. You don't call the police. You don't file a lawsuit. Instead, you engage in a series of highly sophisticated, socially calibrated behaviors that are tens of thousands of years old. You might mention it loudly to a coworker while the perpetrator is nearby, an ancient technique known as public shaming, or you might send a passive-aggressive email to the entire floor, a modern version of a collective warning. This isn't just petty office drama. It is the skeletal remains of the original human legal system. Before we had judges in powdered wigs or police officers with handcuffs, we had something much more intimate and in many ways much more terrifying. We had the group. For the vast majority of our species' existence, we lived in small, tight-knit bands where everyone knew your name, your parents' names, and exactly how many calories you contributed to the last communal meal. In that world, there was no such thing as getting away with it. Privacy was a luxury that hadn't been invented yet, and your reputation was the only currency you actually owned. If you broke the rules, if you stole, if you bullied, if you shirked your duties, you weren't just breaking a law, you were vibrating a web that every other person in the group was holding on to. To understand how ancient humans punished criminals, we have to look at the transition from these small, reputation-based shame cultures to the massive, anonymous guilt cultures of the first cities. It is a journey from the whisper of a neighbor to the cold, hard weight of a stone tablet, and it explains a lot more about your own brain than you might think. Have you ever wondered why it feels so physically painful to be canceled on the internet? It's because for an ancient human, social rejection wasn't just a blow to the ego, it was a literal death sentence. If you were living 40,000 years ago in a band of 30 people, being disliked by the group meant you were no longer invited to the hunt, no longer protected from predators at night, and no longer shared the warmth of the fire. Our brains evolved to treat social status as a survival metric, much like how your phone treats battery life as its primary concern. This is where the first punishments began. Long before anyone thought to build a jail, humans used gossip as their primary policing tool. Dr. Robin Dunbar, an evolutionary psychologist at Oxford, famously argued that gossip evolved as a way to maintain social bonds in large groups, essentially a high-speed data transfer of who is trustworthy and who is a free rider. If you were the guy who always let everyone else do the dangerous work of hunting the mammoth, but showed up first when the meat was being carved, the gossip network would catch you. And trust me, the prehistoric version of Twitter was much more efficient because you couldn't just mute the notifications. Once the gossip network reached a consensus that you were a problem, the punishment moved to the next phase, ridicule. This sounds light to us today, but in an egalitarian hunter-gatherer society, it was devastating. Christopher Boehm, a renowned anthropologist who spent years studying these reverse dominance hierarchies, noted that ancient humans were obsessed with keeping anyone from getting too powerful. If a hunter came back from a successful kill and started bragging, the rest of the group would mock him mercilessly, calling his meat tiny or rotten to ensure his ego didn't lead him to think he was the boss. This leveling mechanism, as anthropologists call it, was a proactive punishment designed to stop a crime before it happened. The crime in this case was the attempt to dominate others. By laughing at the potential tyrant, the group was effectively saying, "We see what you're doing and it won't work here." But what if the ridicule didn't work? What if someone wasn't just a braggart, but a genuine predator, someone who repeatedly stole, committed violence, or endangered the group? This is where the ancient world's version of sentencing became much darker. If you look at the ethnographic records of groups like the Inuit of the Arctic or the San of the Kalahari, you see a very consistent pattern. The first formal step was often a shaming ritual. The Central Inuit, for example, used something called song duels. If someone had wronged you, you didn't punch them in the face, which would lead to a never-ending blood feud that would kill everyone. Instead, you challenged them to a public singing competition. You would stand in front of the entire community and sing original, biting, satirical verses about how much of a loser the other person was. The criminal would then have to sing back. The community would watch, laugh, and eventually choose a winner based on who was the most clever and who had the most social support. The loser would walk away with their reputation in tatters, which, in a world without money or property, was the equivalent of going bankrupt. If you're thinking that a singing contest sounds a bit soft for a murderer, you're right. Ancient humans were pragmatists, and they knew that some people couldn't be sung into being good. When a person became a persistent, existential threat to the group, the punishment escalated to ostracism. This is the social death mentioned earlier. You were told to leave, In a modern context, moving to a new city is a fresh start. In the Paleolithic, moving to a new neighborhood meant walking into the territory of a rival group who would likely kill you on sight or trying to survive the elements alone. Most people didn't last a week. It was a clean, hands-off way for the group to execute someone without actually having to spill blood themselves, which, again, was a strategic move to prevent cycles of revenge. The group simply withdrew the infrastructure of survival from the individual. It was the ultimate user agreement violation. You broke the terms of service, so your account was deleted. Now, as humans began to settle down into the first permanent villages around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, a period we call the Neolithic, the gossip and shame model started to break. This is a crucial turning point in the history of punishment. Once you have a village of 500 people, or a city of 5,000, you no longer know everyone. You can't keep track of who is a free rider just by talking to your cousins. Anonymity, the great friend of the criminal, was born. It's much easier to steal a goat if the person you're stealing from doesn't know your name or where you sleep. This surge in population created a scaling problem for justice. You couldn't just mock a stranger into submission. You needed something more formal, something that didn't rely on personal relationships but on objective rules. This is when the eye for an eye era began, but it didn't look like what you see in the movies. The first written laws weren't actually about vengeance, they were about economics. Take the Code of Ernamu, which dates back to roughly 2100 BC in ancient Sumer. It is the oldest known legal code in existence, and it's surprisingly civilized. Instead of cut off the hand of a thief, most of its provisions are about fines. If you broke someone's limb, you didn't get your own limb broken. You paid a specific amount of silver. This was a restitutive system. The goal was to make the victim whole again, rather than just hurting the offender. It treated crime like a debt, which, if you think about it, is a very Sumerian way of looking at the world. They did invent accounting, after all. This system worked well for a while because it kept people productive. A man with 2 hands and a debt is more useful to the king than a man with 1 hand and a grudge. However, as empires grew and social classes became more rigid, the payment model started to feel unfair. If a rich man can just pay a fine every time he hits someone, is it really a punishment? This tension led us straight to the most famous legal pillar in history, the Code of Hammurabi, carved into a 7-foot-tall block of black diorite around 1750 BC. Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, wanted to create a sense of cosmic justice that applied to everyone. Well, everyone of the same social class anyway. This is where we get asterisk lex talionis asterisk, the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If a builder built a house that collapsed and killed the owner, the builder was executed. If it killed the owner's son, the builder's son was executed. Yes, the ancient world had a very grim view of collective family responsibility. This was retributive justice. It wasn't about fixing the damage, it was about balancing the scales of suffering. The transition from the Sumerian fine-based system to the Babylonian eye for an eye system represents a massive shift in how the human brain processed wrongdoing. We moved from a horizontal system where the community negotiates a fix to a vertical system where a central authority, a king or a god, administers a blow. And this is where things get truly strange. Have you ever wondered why we started locking people in cages? It seems so normal to us now, but for most of human history, prison was a completely nonsensical concept. In a world where food was scarce and every pair of hands was needed for labor, the idea of taking a healthy person, putting them in a room, and feeding them for free while they did nothing was seen as an insane waste of resources. Ancient prisons were usually just holding cells where you waited to be either fined, mutilated, or killed. They weren't the punishment, they were the waiting room. The first real prisons, as we understand them, started appearing in the Ur-3 period of Mesopotamia, but they weren't for common thieves. They were for political prisoners or debt slaves, people the state wanted to keep track of but didn't want to kill yet. For everyone else, punishment was fast, public, and physical. If you were an ancient Egyptian and you were caught stealing, you might receive 100 lashes or, in extreme cases, have your nose cut off. This served 2 purposes. First, it was a deterrent. It's hard to ignore a screaming person in the town square. Second, it was a permanent criminal record written directly onto your face. You didn't need a background check to know if someone was untrustworthy. You just had to look at their nose, or the lack thereof. It was a very low-tech version of a permanent digital footprint. But there was another layer to ancient punishment that we often overlook because we are so focused on the physical. That layer was the supernatural. For many ancient cultures, the most terrifying police officer wasn't a man with a spear, it was a ghost or a god. In ancient Greece, if you committed a murder, you weren't just a criminal, you were polluted. This concept of asterisk miasma asterisk meant that you were spiritually infectious. If the community didn't punish you or drive you out, the gods might send a plague or a drought that would kill everyone. This turned justice into a matter of public health. Punishment wasn't just about the victim's family getting revenge, it was about cleansing the city so that the sun would keep shining and the crops would keep growing. This is why many ancient punishments involved elaborate purification rituals. You had to wash the crime off the community. You can see this same logic in the ordeals of the Middle Ages, which actually have roots in much older ancient traditions. If the community couldn't figure out who stole the ox, they would ask the gods to decide. You might have to pick a stone out of a pot of boiling water. If your hand healed cleanly in 3 days, you were innocent. If it got infected, you were guilty. Statistically, this was actually more fair than it sounds, because priests often manipulated the temperature of the water based on how much they suspected the person. It was essentially a high-stakes vibe check masquerading as divine intervention. The point was that the authority for the punishment came from outside the human realm, which made it much harder for the criminal's family to argue or seek revenge. The god said he did it is a much better conversation ender than the neighbors think he did it. This brings us to a fascinating psychological quirk, the ultimatum game. Economists use this experiment today to show that humans are biologically wired to punish unfairness, even when it costs us personally. In the game, person A is given $20 and told to share it with person B. If person B accepts the offer, they both keep the money. If person B rejects it, neither of them gets anything. Pure logic says that if person A offers only $1, person B should take it after all. $1 is better than 0. But almost universally, across every culture on Earth, person B will reject the small offer. They would rather get nothing than see person A get away with being unfair. We are the descendants of people who are willing to burn the money to punish a free rider. Our brains are literally hardwired to get a hit of dopamine when we see a bad guy get what's coming to them. This is why revenge movies are a billion-dollar industry. They are essentially digital dopamine dispensers for our Paleolithic sense of justice. As we move toward the end of the ancient world and the rise of the Roman Empire, we see the final form of this evolution, the professionalization of punishment. The Romans took the Greek idea of citizenship and the Babylonian idea of written code and turned them into a massive bureaucratic machine. For the first time, you had a clear distinction between civil law, you broke a contract, and criminal law, you broke the peace of the state. Roman punishment was hyper-stratified. If you were a citizen, you had the right to a trial, and if sentenced to death, a merciful execution like beheading. If you weren't a citizen, if you were a slave or a foreigner, the state used you as a prop for public entertainment. Being thrown to the lions in the Colosseum wasn't just a spectacle, it was the ultimate expression of the state's power to unmake a person who had violated its laws. It was the reverse dominance hierarchy of the hunter-gatherers flipped on its head. Now, the one, the emperor, dominated the many, the people, through the calculated use of terror. So, how did we get from singing duels in the snow to the Roman arena? It was a trade-off. We traded the intimacy of the small group for the security of the large one. In a small band, punishment is personal, flexible, and aimed at keeping the group together. In a city, punishment is impersonal, rigid, and aimed at keeping the system running. But even today, that ancient shame-based system hasn't actually gone away. It's just moved into the digital world. When someone is shamed on social media, we are using the exact same gossip and ridicule loop that our ancestors used 50,000 years ago. We are still trying to level people who think they are more important than the group. The only difference is that in the ancient world, the shaming ended when the person corrected their behavior. In the digital world, the gossip never dies, and the ostracism never ends because the village never forgets. It's a Paleolithic tool being used on a global scale, and our brains aren't quite sure how to handle the lack of an off switch. If you look at the Tiwi people of North Australia, they have a fascinating ritual for resolving conflicts. When a man has wronged someone, he is forced to stand in a clearing while the injured party throws spears at him. But there's a catch. The man who is being punished is allowed to dodge. The goal isn't necessarily to kill him, it's to allow the victim to vent their rage in a controlled way while the community watches. Once a spear finally nicks the offender, usually in the thigh, the debt is considered paid. They have a feast, they dance, and the crime is literally deleted from history. No one is allowed to mention it again. Compare that to our modern system, where a criminal record follows you to every job interview for the rest of your life. The Tiwi understood something that we've largely forgotten. The point of punishment isn't just to hurt the offender. It's to heal the community, so it can keep functioning. Now, before you start thinking that ancient justice was better because it was natural, let's have a quick reality check. The ancient world was also a place of blood feuds. If your brother killed my cousin, my family was often culturally obligated to kill someone in your family. This could go on for generations until both families were wiped out. This is why the invention of the state and the law was actually such a relief for most people. It took the right to punish out of the hands of angry individuals and put it into the hands of a neutral third party. We gave up the right to seek our own revenge in exchange for the promise that someone else would do it for us. We traded the spear in the thigh for a summons to court. It's less exciting, but it's a lot better for our collective life expectancy. What's truly fascinating is that even after thousands of years of civilization, we still haven't found a better way to change behavior than the ancient tools of reputation and social pressure. Studies in modern behavioral economics have shown that people are much more likely to pay their taxes if they are told that 9 out of 10 people in your neighborhood have already paid theirs, than if they are threatened with a fine. We are still that social animal living in a band of 30 people, desperately looking around to see what everyone else thinks of us. Parenthetically, this is why those "please conserve water" signs in hotels work better if they say most guests in this room reuse their towels. We literally cannot stop ourselves from trying to fit in with the group, even a group of people we've never met. Ultimately, the history of punishment is the history of the human scale. When we lived in small groups, we didn't need laws because we had us. We had a shared story, a shared survival, and a shared shame. As we built bigger and bigger societies, we had to invent the law to replace that missing us. We had to build the system to do the work that gossip used to do for free. We moved from the inner voice of communal belonging to the outer voice of the police officer and the judge. We traded the singing duel for the lawsuit and the social death of exile for the physical walls of the prison. We became civilized, which is just a fancy way of saying we became governable by people who don't know who we are. It's easy to look back at the eye for an eye or the song duel and think of it as a primitive relic of a vanished world. We like to imagine that we've moved past those raw emotional mechanisms and replaced them with something rational and objective. But the reality is that the ancient world didn't go anywhere. It's just buried under a few layers of concrete and paperwork. Every time you feel that surge of heat when someone disrespects you, or that cold prickle of fear when you realize you've made a social faux pas, you are feeling the exact same biological hardware that kept the peace in the Paleolithic. You are still that ancient human, and the group is still watching you. Do you think our modern system of anonymous punishment, where we lock people away and try to forget they exist, is actually more humane than the ancient system of public communal resolution? Or have we just found a way to hide the blood without actually fixing the harm? It's a question worth asking the next time you see someone being shamed online. Because at the end of the day, we are all just one bad decision away from realizing that the village still has a very long memory. If you enjoyed this dive into the dark corners of our shared history, you might want to stick around for our next deep dive into how ancient humans viewed the end of the world. Just click that subscribe button to join the band. But before you go, consider this. For 99% of your ancestors, the idea of a stranger judging your actions was an impossible nightmare. Today, it's your entire reality. We live in a world where the people who decide your fate, from the algorithm that determines your credit score to the judge who signs a warrant, will never know your name or look you in the eye. You have achieved the ultimate ancient dream. You are finally free from the prying eyes of your neighbors, but you have paid for that freedom with the most expensive thing a human can lose. You have become anonymous to the very system that is supposed to protect you. And in the cold logic of history, there is no punishment more permanent than being forgotten by the group while you are still alive.